So in this section what we're looking at is Lightroom Classic for editing and how we can edit pictures. We've had a look at how we can import images and create catalogues and collections and all that part of it, but now it's actually editing a photograph. And if we look at this photograph, first of all I'm going to comment a little bit about the actual photograph that I've taken there, because a lot of people say, well, that's underexposed, and it is. But this is something that's really important to understand when using a camera, is that if you're shooting in RAW, it's not like you're shooting in JPEG. You haven't got to get the picture out of the actual shot that you take. If you're shooting in JPEG, you're trying to record the actual scene and trying to capture it all in camera. But when you're shooting in RAW, you need to think a little bit about how you can get the best from the photo. Now if I was to shoot this at an higher exposure, so if I was to expose it more, we would be losing the detail in the water. So if we look at the histogram, and this is the first thing we look at when we're editing pictures, is if I look at this histogram, I can see that I'm well below the highlighted area. So this little map that's up there shows us, to the right hand side it shows us the highlights in the picture, and we can see that, you know, I'm well under the highlight area, and in this area, in the dark area, I'm a little bit overexposed. If I put the mouse on there, you can see those blue areas, so they are completely black. Now I know in RAW that I could bring those back if I wanted to. I may not want to, I may want to remain that to be black, but we'll see as we go along. But that's the important part. So sometimes when I'm shooting something such as this subject, let's say it was a white seagull or a waterfall as in this case, and you've got these really bright highlights, you don't want to blow that, you don't want to overexpose it and not be able to pull that back. So therefore, if you're shooting white subjects, especially snow, things like that, always try to underexpose a little bit, and you're not capturing the shot on the camera, you're capturing the raw file, so you can adjust it to get exactly what you want or what's in your head, not that what's on the camera. So you have to think a little bit differently sometimes when you're capturing pictures to get the best out of them, and this is an instance of that. So I quite like the water how it is. If we have a look on there, we can look at the sliders now and explain what all these do. Now first of all, we need to make sure that we're in the develop mode. So at the top you probably might be in library, so we click on develop to make sure that we can see all this part of the screen where we've got the sliders and everything. Now the right hand side you've got sort of snapshots and presets. I never use presets, so I'm just going to hide that and get that out of the way. So it's gone now. There we are. So I can click on that little triangle and get rid of that. Just gives me a bit more screen, and also I'm editing this picture, so I can bring this down a little bit, make this smaller, and just make my image bigger to work on. This is the main section that I'm going to be working with. Now what we need to understand first of all is these sliders. Now the temperature and the tint, you've got presets on here. You've got white balance on there, and you've got that shot. Now I will go over white balance in a different section. I'm not going to worry too much about this. The white balance in this case is fine. Where we've got this as shot, now this is where people quite often think, oh, I've got to, you know, change these settings on my camera. When you're shooting in RAW, you don't have to set it to daylight or cloudy or shade or anything like that, because by simply clicking on this now, I can do that. The image contains all that information, so that's cloudy, that's daylight, which a lot use. I'll just leave it as shot. If you work to a temperature, let's say you work to a temperature, this is the temperature of the shot there, and you can actually type in a temperature. So let's say normal daylight is usually around 5,500 Kelvin, so I can type in 5,000 Now don't worry about that, I'm just giving this as an example because some people won't understand that, but that has changed the temperature now, so you know, we'll actually start at that. But don't worry too much about the temperature, we'll talk about that at a different stage. Okay, so if we look at this now, and we look at the sliders, let's look at the expose slider first of all and what that does. So if I drag it down to the left, it makes it darker, and you can see the histogram changing, so all the information now is in this area until it gets to black. And if I do the opposite and I go this way, we're blowing out all the highlights completely. So it starts off in the middle. If I double click this at any time, by the way, if I double click that little side, it'll return back to the middle. That's handy to know. So if I look at this image, exposure wise, if I was to try and get it right just by putting the exposure up, I need to look at the histogram. And I can see that I'm not blowing the highlights at this stage. So we'll do it like this. So right, if I want to get the blacks perfect, I can now bring the blacks up. So this is the white area, this is the black area on the histogram, and I can drag that up a little bit, and now that triangle's disappeared. So now I'm supposedly got the perfect exposure, but I haven't, have I? Because if we look, I'm losing all the detail in this. So if I zoom into this now and I go to the next part, so if we look at the histogram, this is the white section, and if we go along, can you see that this is being highlighted? If you look at that section, you can see that's the white section, and this area is the highlights. So if I bring the highlights down, you can see I'm bringing some of that detail back. Now I've almost gone all the way down. I'm not bothered about that. I don't mind going all the way down. I'm getting that detail back. And if I want to get back up to this side of the histogram, I could now use the whites just to give a bit more lightness. But you can see by taking down the highlights and bringing the whites up, I've brought much more detail into the water. So if I look at that now, that is probably, if we was doing an overall edit, that would probably be the perfect image. We look at the histogram's fine. We can now see into the shadow and whatever. And it looks quite nice. It's not a bad photograph. It's not always the way I work. Let's say you wanted an HDR look. If you want an HDR look, I hate too much HDR. Sometimes it looks okay though. But if I brought the highlights all the way down to the left and I bring the shadows all the way up, it flattens the image out and we get this HDR look. You could probably take the blacks down a little bit and you get this type of look. Now I often see people editing like this and everything looks a little bit flat to me. Sometimes it looks okay with some shots, but it just looks a little bit artificial, and for this type of shot I just don't think it works. So having showed you that, that's the overall. So how to get a nice, a nice edit on there and get a nice natural look and then an HDR look such as that. We now know that the different areas on the histogram, so if we look at there and we click on that, that is actually going to the shadow area, and you can see that altering. So you can see it highlights when I click on the histogram. I think by bringing the shadows down, I would probably be more happy with something like that. So it's your eyes that do the editing, but it's the histogram. Now it has, you can see a little bit peeking there. If I put you can see those black areas, tiny little areas over here, which would be black anyway, so I'm not bothered about that. But that would probably be my tweak if I was doing an overall raw adjustment for the image. However, sometimes another way of working, let's just reset this and get it back to where it was. Another way of working is to build it up in little sections by using, instead of an overall adjustment, but to use local adjustments. And the first thing we need to do is just to get it, basically I want to get that water looking how I want it. So I want to bring the highlights down, bring a little bit more detail in there, bring the whites up to add a bit more lightness to it. And okay, I'm happy with that. I think I may take the highlights down just a little bit more. Okay, now my next stage would be to make a local adjustment. Now the local adjustments can be made with this tool. So we've got all different tools on here. We're going to look at this one first of all. That's the adjustment brush. So if I click on the adjustment brush, I then get a brush, and it's got all these sliders on. I can paint areas on here that I want to change. Now first of all, I'm going to double click on the word effect, and that will put all the sliders back into the middle. So the word effect there, that's just a quick shortcut way of resetting this to the defaults. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to brighten up some areas. Now I'm not too worried about how bright I do them, so I'm going to turn this up quite high. So I'm going to take the exposure up. And the reason I'm just doing that blindly and I'm taking it up to around that setting is when I do anything now, I'll be able to see quite easily the parts that I'm affecting. For instance, if I want to bring this bit up, you can see it's overexposed. But we can adjust that after. But what it enables me to see is to see where I've actually adjusted parts of the image. It's a little bit dark down here, so we'll bring a bit of that in and a bit of this in down here. Now, I'm not going mad, I'm just doing little areas. Just little bits I'd like to tweak and just bring a little bit of lightness to. Okay, so having done that, now what I do is I'm going to take that exposure back down. Now you can see I've got full control of how much light I want on that area that I've painted. And I'll think about there. So I'm trying to build a picture up with light. I don't want it too bright on the edges. I want that because the main emphasis is on this area. So the surrounding area I don't want to bring up, and that's why I'm not doing adjusting the whole image. I'm making local adjustments because I don't want it to affect the whole image. I just want it to affect the parts I want to make brighter or darker. Now the top of the image up here is quite distracting because it just brings your eye up to the top there, and we need to dampen that down a bit. So using the adjustment brush again, I'm going to click on the word new, and this gives me a new adjustment. Now I'm going to bring the exposure down, and again it doesn't matter too much. I could bringing it down quite low, and I just want to darken this part of the image down a little bit. So once I've done that and I can see where I've done, I can then bring that exposure back up just to a level. So see, it's only a little bit, but because I took it down quite low, I could easily see the areas that I'd affected. And we can do this in all areas. We can say, okay, I'm happy with that. Let's do new again. Is there anywhere else? I'd like to just brighten this water coming up around here, maybe get a bit more texture in these areas. So let's do a texture one. In this area here, let's bring a little bit more out of the water. So I'm going to double click the word effect. I'm going to go down to the texture. And again, not too worried how much you put on there. And also a little bit of clarity. And I'm going to draw over this water here, just in the middle section. Just to bring some texture out in these areas. I might do that rock as well, just there. So I've got like a line of texture coming through the image. Which brings your eye to that area because it's more sharply in focus than other areas. Okay, now that is too much, but I can play now. I can bring the texture down a bit. Or maybe put it up and bring the clarity down. No, we want the clarity up. So I don't want it too much, I just want to bring a little bit there. Click on done. And now you can see we brought some texture into that water there and to the rock in the foreground. So straight away my eye comes to this rock, and then it's followed through by this area, which could probably be, these little areas here could be a bit brighter. So let's go back to the brush again, double click the word effect. Let's take the exposure up a little bit. I'm guessing now I'm just, again, I can adjust that. I just want to bring these areas just a tiny bit, not that much. So then I can slide that back down to where I want it to be. It's also looking a little bit blue, so let's try reducing the blue. If I go to the temperature and I put just a tiny bit of yellow on there, so I'm getting sort of a similar effect to what's going on up here. I'm taking the blue out of the water and get this bit of brown in there. Okay, so let's click done on that. Now I've made those local adjustments. Now I can make an overall adjustment if I need to. So I'm looking at the image thinking, oh, perhaps it's a little bit dark. I can bring the blacks up. I can bring the shadows up a little bit. Take down the highlights, and there we have, I think, a much more dramatic image. So by building it up in stages, we can say exactly what we want over the old image. Now I can take the texture down just a little bit because I think I've gone a bit overboard on that rock. That's taking it down all over the image, but I'm not too worried about that. I don't want it, that's looking better. There we are. So that is how you do the basic edits using local adjustments and using overall adjustments in Lightroom Classic. And we'll be looking at other things we can do. So we've gone over the adjustment brush. There are other tools in there that can be useful for other parts of the image, or different images, completely different images. And we'll be having a look at what those tools do and how we can use them.